This is African American History is American History. Welcome. I'm your host, Harlan Kearsley. This program's goal is to foster understanding, promote discussion, and expand knowledge through stories of historical events, bios of unsung heroes, as well as timely and relevant news stories which, hopefully, will paint a vivid picture of the effects of segregation, discrimination, and bigotry on the lives of both blacks and whites. Comparisons will be made between the many racially fractured periods of American history and what's going on right now. As part of terrorism and suppression of black people from the Reconstruction era into the Jim Crow era, racially motivated violent crimes were committed with frequency throughout the United States, with the largest concentration in the South. These crimes, often lynchings of black men, were rarely, if ever, prosecuted or even investigated. In 2015, a study by the Equal Justice Initiative, a nonprofit that provides legal counsel to the poor, found that almost 4,000 lynchings, mostly of black men, took place in the South. The study calculated that there were 3,959 lynchings in the South from the end of the Reconstruction era in 1877 to 1950 alone. The vast majority of people responsible for these lynchings, generally mobs or small groups of white local residents, were never held responsible for their actions. During the civil rights era of the 1950s to the early 1970s, additional waves of more isolated killings or lynchings took place. They were committed by smaller groups organized in opposition to integration and civil rights, such as KKK chapters, neo-Nazi groups, or just individuals. In 2007, pushing Congress to acknowledge this gap in our historical knowledge, the late Representative John Lewis introduced the Emmett Till Unsolved Civil Rights Crime Act. The U.S. House of Representatives passed the legislation on June 20th, 2007, by a vote of 422 to 2. The U.S. Senate passed the legislation on September 24, 2008, by unanimous consent, and President George W. Bush signed the bill into law on October 7th of that year. The law was named after Emmett Till, a 14-year-old black teenager from Chicago who, in the summer of 1955, on a visit to family in Mississippi, was accused of whistling at a young married white woman in a grocery store. He was abducted, beaten, tortured, mutilated, and shot in the head before his body was weighed down and thrown in the Tallahatchie River. Till's murderers were tried but were acquitted by an all-white jury. At the time, blacks were prohibited from voting, and thus they generally were excluded from juries. The two men later confessed to killing Till in an interview with Life magazine in exchange for $4,000. They were never retried or convicted for his murder. Many years later, the woman who had accused Till of behaving inappropriately admitted that she had lied about the events. The Emmett Till Unsolved Civil Rights Crime Act authorized the Department of Justice to coordinate with local authorities and investigate racially motivated homicides that occurred before 1970. The problem was, the act has never been adequately funded, and its narrow focus on viable prosecutions limited its efficacy. Along with lack of money, lack of time was the biggest enemy of the Emmett Till Unsolved Civil Rights Crime Act. Many homicides could no longer be prosecuted. In some cases, the government had limited federal jurisdiction. In others, witnesses and perpetrators had died. The NAACP voiced their concern that the United States Department of Justice closed a number of cases in which members of various Klan and other hate groups and organizations who participated in these killings may still be alive. The initial goal of the Emmett Till Unsolved Civil Rights Crime Act was to reopen these cold cases and bring perpetrators to justice and discover the truths behind the events. It was thought that new technologies, less bias, and more investigation by the FBI might reveal new information. It did not.
This is African American History is American History.
From 2008 to 2015, only one case made it to court and resulted in a successful prosecution. That was the case of Jimmy Lee Jackson, an unarmed black man who was fatally shot in Alabama in 1964 by James Fowler, a state police officer. Fowler pleaded guilty to manslaughter and served 6 months in prison. The bill was reauthorized on December 10, 2016, and changes were made to address concerns about how it was operating. The Emmett Till Unsolved Civil Rights Crimes Reauthorization Act contained a number of new provisions intended to increase the success of solving at least some of the many cold cases still on the books. These changes included connecting the FBI, the Department of Justice, and law enforcement officers to organizations such as universities or advocacy groups that were also investigating cold cases from the civil rights era. Other changes to the bill included expanding the time period to which the bill applied. So instead of only working cases before 1970, the bill now included all cases before December 31st, 1979. The bill expired at the end of the 2017 fiscal year, and in 2018, the Emmett Till Unsolved Civil Rights Crime Act was not reauthorized. And much like the cold cases the act was designed to solve, it has been abandoned and filed away. On March 29, 2022, President Joe Biden signed into law the Emmett Till Anti-Lynching Act of 2022. It's a bill that makes lynching a federal hate crime. Federal prosecutors can now seek up to a 30-year prison sentence. However, many legal experts warn that the law may not be as effective as intended. Kara Gotch, Deputy Director of the Sentencing Project, argues that compiling sentences does more harm than good because there's little proof that hate crime laws, such as the Anti-Lynching Act, actually deter hate crimes. In a 2016 report, the Justice Department found that laws and policies intended to deter crime by focusing on increased sentences are ineffective. This is partly because people know very little about criminal sanctions for specific crimes. Michael Lieberman, a senior policy counsel at the Southern Poverty Law Center, believes that the Emmett Till Anti-Lynching Act of 2022 is important symbolically, since until this bill was signed into law, the federal government was incapable of calling a lynching a lynching. But Mr. Lieberman also agrees that educational efforts would be a better tool to actually deter hate crimes.
This has been African American History is American History, the episode you've been listening to.
Whatever Happened to the Emmett Till Unsolved Civil Rights Crime Act was written and directed by Harlan Kearsley. I'm Harlan Kearsley, and on behalf of everyone here at African American History is American History, thank you for listening. And if you haven't done so, please subscribe. Once you do, you'll be notified as soon as new episodes are posted. Thanks again, and please stay safe. African American History is American History. Copyright H.C. Kearsley, 2022.